This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 343. Who will win the money war between BRICs and the West?
I've been an economist for 50 years. I went through the Great Recession. I have never seen such raging incompetence ever.
But it's notable that 80% of the overshoot over the target at that point is due to energy and tradable goods.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, if the West decouples itself from China and other autocratic regimes, just as we have done to an extent with Russia, what does that mean for international trade? What does it mean for international investment if we exclude money from countries that are growing faster than we are? And by we, of course, we mean anywhere in the West, because the world is split between high-growth autocratic regimes and slow-growth democracies. Maybe we should just appoint a dictator. Would that fix the problem? Meanwhile, how is world trade impacted if there's a divide between the BRICS nations and the West? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So Pola has written in and asked, any chance you could talk about foreign debts and how this works? Also, what impacts are likely to occur as the global south, BRICs, etc., move to payments in their own currencies instead of US dollars or bartering? So, which is interesting. He goes on to something else, talking about the price of things, which we might talk about on a separate podcast. But just his first part of his question. So, first of all, you know, the definition of debt, which obviously is very different to a trade deficit. So a country can have debt, but could be operating a trade surplus. So Germany has a trade surplus of 220 billion US dollars, but it's got 6 trillion in debt. So is there any relationship between surplus and debt, or are they two disconnected things?
Well, they're disconnected, but in a combobulated way, because, right. I mean, what people call, like, we talk about governments having debt. Governments, if you're looking at a particular country like, well, not like Germany because it doesn't have its own currency anymore, but if you look at Britain, which for all this other mistakes still has its own currency, then what is called government debt, bonds that have been sold by the government to cover the deficit and interest payments on the deficit. So there'll be necessarily bonds outstanding, which could be a large percentage of GDP, but they're not debt in the same sense that you've borrowed money and you've got to pay it back to somebody else. So with the government debt,
so the government could be borrowing a great deal to try and pay for social services.
No, it's the government is spending a great deal.
Right.
By spending a great deal, then it spends more than it gets back in taxes. It's required by laws passed by the Parliament, not by any, not by. I saw a wonderful. I watched the Tesla launch back on March the 1st, or summaries of the whole thing. And I noticed that one of those sayings inside Tesla is that there are laws of physics. Everything else is a recommendation. Now, so this is a recommendation, the laws we have, and those laws recommend that a government that spends more than it takes back in taxes, i.e. a government which creates fiat money, has to issue bonds equivalent to the gap between the two. And so that's what the government does. So, if the British government runs a deficit of, let's say, for the heck of the number, not because it's what they do, £1 trillion, then they have to issue £1 trillion worth of bonds. Now, how are the bonds bought? When the £1 trillion of deficit spending goes into people's bank accounts, then £1 trillion of reserves turns up in the bank accounts as well, which earn a lower rate of interest, like say maybe a 2% rate of interest, and then the government says, well, we're going to issue bonds, we're going to offer 2.25% on the bonds. Yeah. Would you like to convert the two across? Okay, so it is not borrowing, and I wish I could finance my spending that way. Okay, but I'd need to become a money creator to do it, and I believe that's illegal unless you happen to be the country.
I think you'd get found out pretty quickly. But that would, when you're looking at that number though, trying to get this difference between a trading surplus or a trading deficit versus the debt which has been carried. So the debt would be But you would be counting those bonds would be counted as...
The bonds are counted as debt, but that's domestic debt. However, then what you get happening with central banks, and this is a global phenomenon for central banks, they buy a diversified portfolio of other countries' debts to have part of their asset backing for the central bank itself. So what you'll... And then, of course, if you have the central bank of Germany... Okay, buying bonds issued by the Bank of England, then the Bank of England is part of the money created by the Treasury to service that debt. So again, when interest payments are made, that again is something which is also covered by bond issue. The British government's creating those pounds. They get sent as income to the Central Bank of Germany. But again, that's money creation by the British government.
Yeah.
Okay. So it does cause an outflow of money from the British economy to the German economy. But the fact you've got this foreign debt ends up being governments, central banks around the world buying a portfolio of each other's government's bonds as part of their overall asset backing. So it ends up being very, very different to when you actually have an investment, you have a development project you want to do, you don't have the revenue, and you then go to the World Bank or go to private lenders to borrow that money, then you do have to service a debt in another currency with your own money. So to really dive into that foreign debt figures, you'd need to see to what extent is this bonds issued by one country held by the central bank of another.
Right. But but then that'd also be what's happening in the private sector, influencing this. Yeah,
and then whether people are borrowing. The only reason, like if you borrow money in
foreign currencies,
foreign currency, as a private corporation, it's because you need that foreign currency to buy goods made in another country. Okay, you don't borrow it to buy. You don't borrow American dollars in England to buy English goods. Okay, so it's a very, very different situation when you're borrowing a foreign currency as a non-government entity than you're doing it to buy foreign goods.
So there's no direct correlation.
Sorry?
There's no direct correlation.
No direct correlation. It's a real mess. To really untangle that stuff, you need to dive in very, very deeply and see who's holding the debt. Is the debt actual loans or is it bonds? It's a very big mess, and whereas the trade deficit is much more straightforward.
Yeah.
Even that though involves a huge amount of financial transfers, because if you do have outstanding debt, then yes, that is part of your outflow. The interest servicing costs and the volume of money that's involved in asset speculation far exceeds the volume involved in trade. So what actually is setting your exchange, the value of your currency, is more driven by speculation by a factor of 10 or 20 than it is by trade flows. So trade flows end up being fairly straightforward to discuss in one sense, but very murky when you try to relate them to the financial position.
If you've got sort of foreign direct investment happening, then that would be that investment would be counted as debt, presumably, in the country that is issuing that investment.
Yeah.
So you'd be quite happy to take that investment to try and increase your trade surplus, for example, or to improve your trade position because you want to increase the productivity of your country. I think what we're saying is at the end of this, the complex international flows in debt and trade. But we do know, of course, that trade figure always has to balance out to zero for the globe.
Yeah.
So someone's surplus is someone else's deficit. So I wonder how that will change, which is getting back to Pola's question. And of course, there's also the fact of the importance of the American dollar in so much of that trade as well.
This is one thing which you look back and say, well, what would have happened if America hadn't won not World War II but the Bretton Woods? Because the decision, the proposal that Keynes put on the table at Bretton Woods, and he was the most serious contributor intellectually, was to create an international currency called the Bancor.
Yeah.
And that would have been the currency for international trade. And Harry Dexter White, who was the chief of the American delegation, and probably under orders from the Americans as well, but I don't know enough of the history of Bretton Woods. To what extent was that an individual pressure from Dexter White, or was it government policy for the Americans? But what that meant was the American dollar became the currency for international trade. So you had to have American dollars to get involved in international trade, and therefore to actually engage in the trade, you've got to, if you don't actually have a trade surplus yourself, you've got to borrow the dollars. So what that does is ultimately inflate the value of the American dollar. You don't look, if you want British pounds after the Second World War, then you want British pounds to buy British goods. But if you want American dollars after the Second World War, you want American dollars to be able to take place in international trade at all. And so that gives you a need to have a debt, in effect, in American dollars, just so that you can function in global trade. That debt should be, A, shouldn't exist, and B, it should be something based on your holdings of Bancor in the International Monetary Fund, which is not the world we ended up in, thanks to Harry Dexter White.
Yeah, and you wonder how different that world would be. I mean, for example, Russia probably wouldn't have quite so much of an attitude against the US. It's possible we would be in the midst of a war. Those BRICS nations might not be looking at alternatives to using the US dollar if we weren't so reliant on the US dollar.
I think a huge part of our mess is the fact we do have the American dollar as the basis of trade, and it also has undermined the American manufacturing sector, because one of the best people on this is Yanis Varoufakis, with his idea of what he calls the global minotaur, and he said to maintain a system in which a national currency is used for international trade, then the rest of the world has to be borrowing that money. And that's a large part of the figures you're going to be looking at that Pola's curious about as well. So you've got to borrow American dollars to have American dollars to get involved in trade. And that therefore means there's more demand for American dollars over and above the demand for American goods, which means you strengthen the financial sector and weaken the industrial sector.
So 40% of all transactions on the planet are in US dollars.
Yeah.
And the US is involved in, so whether you're buying or selling, 10% of all trade. So 4 times as much than the actual...
huge difference. And that gives you a completely distorted system. It's a large part of why we've had a financialised global economy. It's the reason where the power for the financial sector has come from. So if Harry Dexter White, and I've got to really check and read the history of Bretton Woods properly, because I'd like to know the extent to which it was individual and the extent to which it was government policy. Clearly you had to get government approval. But the outcome of that was just like where Keynes said the terms of the First World War set up the conditions for the Second World War. In some ways, Bretton Woods, as it was executed versus how it was supposed to be, has set up the terms for the financialisation of the post-war economy, and now the pressure for China and Russia and the other countries to break away from American dominance.
Yeah. So the idea of Bancor, just for those who have, if you're regular listeners to this podcast, we've spoken about it lots of times, but the whole idea behind that was that we didn't trade in the US dollar. We
trade in an international currency called a Bancor. The Bancor would have been a fixed relationship to each country's currency. So like maybe one American dollar might have been one Bancor, and 2 British pounds might have been one Bancor, that sort of relationship. And then you had to maintain the Bancors. It would have been issued by, I think it was the International Monetary Fund. That was the vision that Keynes, what became the International Monetary Fund was in Keynes' model the generator of Bancors, and they'd be issued proportional to the size of the economy. So if your economy grew faster than another economy over time, you get more Bancors issued to reflect that. But if you ran a trade deficit, of course, you'd run out of Bancors, and then you'd be forced to devalue. But equally, if you're running a surplus, you were forced to partly the surplus itself would be taxed by the IMF, and the tax would have been used as a way of distributing income to developing economies. So the whole thing was about trying to avoid beggar thy neighbour policies. And like one point people know...
But it does sound a bit like the IMF behaving like a central bank, but on a global scale,
yeah,
doesn't
exactly.
it?
And that's...
But that's a bit of a worry, isn't it?
Well, it's worse with what it's done instead. It's behaved as a neoclassical economist.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. We'll give you money so long as you do X, Y, and Z.
As long as you impose austerity upon your people, etc., etc., destroy your education system and infrastructure and so on, and you starve to death while you export food to another country. So I think the IMF would have been a damn sight less destructive than it's been. It would have had more power but less destructive effect. So that's one of my great regrets in terms of economic policy, making the American dollar the reserve currency. So on that basis, I'm actually quite, whatever else is done in the name of the BRICs, I'm quite in favour of something which breaks the dominance of the American system dollar, because we should have done it after the Second World War. We didn't.
Well,
we'll do it now.
Let's have a look when we come back. We'll look at what could happen then if we do get this breakaway from the BRICS nation and they stop trading in the US dollar. If the US dollar goes from 40% of trade to actually something that just reflects the 10% of trade that actually happens to the United States.
10%, it's a huge change.
Big change. So what impact does that have on the global economy? We'll look at that when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast with me. I'm Phil Dobbie, Steve Keen sitting opposite me. We'll be back in just a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So yes, we are. This week we are answering a question from Pola, who has asked about. He first of all wanted to talk about foreign debt, but also the relationships between the West and BRICS nations, and how if they break away from sort of the monetary system as it currently stands to go it alone, and we become less reliant on the US dollar, what does all that mean? And so this term BRICS, by the way, I think it came from a guy called Jim O'Neill, who was the head of Goldman Sachs. He had Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and then for some reason South Africa was added to it as the countries that would dominate the global economy by 2050. It wasn't seen as a bad thing. It was just these are the countries that Goldman Sachs in those days was saying were an opportunity for foreign investment. But those countries now, perhaps they're becoming a risk for foreign investment, because a lot of these countries are now wanting to really go it alone, and starting to talk about trading less in the US dollar, and perhaps, they could form their own equivalent of, the US dollar. They could do the Bancor, the Bancor equivalent. We think about it in Europe. We started with before the euro. We started. There was a trading currency that existed sort of over the ECU. So we could have the equivalent of the
global ECU
or a BRIC ECU.
Yeah.
And how would that change things?
Well, just one thing. I often wonder, why do people come up with such lousy acronyms? Because BRICS is one obvious arrangement. No, not so obvious arrangement of those 5 letters.
Have you got an anagram?
Crib.
Right.
Okay, cribs. That's much more. Where you put babies,
it sounds more friendly, you think, than bricks.
Well, it's also,
bricks is building, though, isn't it?
Yeah, okay, I suppose it's bricks and mortar over who wants kids anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in these countries, they probably think we've got enough of those. We don't need any more.
Absolutely. Children, yeah. So,
that was a very convincing view from Steve as well. So it's someone who doesn't have kids.
That's right. I could get away with it.
Yeah. So if they did develop their own sort of trading currency, and they said, well, between us, we don't need to go through the US dollar. We don't. Yeah. We can just look after ourselves in terms of our own transactions.
And that would, first it would weaken the American financial sector, and that would be a brilliant idea. The vampire squid would have 2 of its limbs cut off, which would be a damn good idea.
So it wouldn't hurt the rest of America, though, would it?
Well, it actually benefit the rest of America.
Because the US dollar would be worth so much less.
Because at the moment, you've got to, if your demand for your dollar is 4 times the demand for your goods, then you are going to have an overvalued dollar no matter what. And that means when you want to compete internationally, even despite the fact that you have, like you use the wrong voltage for your goods and services and so on, you would have far higher exports, and the manufacturing sector of America would be far more viable. So a large part of the deindustrialization of America, I think you can trace right back to the role of the American dollar as a global currency. And this is one thing which I think it was, again, I think Keynes was one of the authors, but I'm not sure of the main authors on this front. It's called the curse of the dominant currency, because if your currency is used for international trade, it's going to be overvalued, so your manufacturing sector will suffer. And that's what Britain went through when it was, before the Second World War, when it was the currency for international trade. So this was a chance to get away from that, and we didn't take it. But if we do take it now by having a separate system, then you have a reduced desire for the American dollar. If you want to buy Saudi Arabian oil, if the Saudis will accept the BRICS proto-currency rather than the American dollar, then the demand for American dollars falls. and that would reduce the exchange value of the American dollar, which would be a damn good thing for American manufacturing.
So the other thing that BRICS obviously want to do is trade amongst themselves more as well. So, I mean, we talk about, China starting to focus a little more on people closer to them, or perhaps to their way of thinking, trading more with autocracies than democracies. And what does that mean for the West if we can't get cheaper goods? Well, we might be able to get cheaper goods coming from America now because the dollar is worth.
Well, what would it mean? They would be paying more for foreign goods.
Yeah.
Okay, so the benefit in that bizarre sense for Americans is having an overvalued currency. You can buy foreign goods at a lower price, and that includes oil. Okay. Now, if you find that you have a decline in the value of your dollar, then you've got to pay more for those inputs. Now, America is still, in a global sense, it's the least interconnected economy. They've got the highest proportion of demand for American goods versus demand for foreign goods globally. Exports and imports are a much smaller fraction of the American economy than most other economies. So the sheer scale of the American economy, is
gross national product is about 24 trillion. US dollars, and they import 450 billion. So let's call it half a trillion out of that. It's 24 trillion.
It's tiny. Whereas you look at the British situation, even the European, would be a much higher level of import. So it's not a big. This is American exceptionalism, which has worked in its favour.
Yes, because it wouldn't be a big transition for them to say, well, okay, out of that 24 trillion, we're importing half a trillion. We just need to make a half a trillion of extra stuff locally, and we're self-sufficient. So
mind you that the industrial development involved in that is pretty huge, and there's certainly a bit of pressure for that anyway out of the decline of globalization courtesy of COVID. So parts of it the Americans wouldn't be complaining about, but they would get an inflationary hit from it. But, to get away, this is, again, the usual story. America's turned a service into a weapon. Because for a while, and I think they're still doing it to some extent, SWIFT, which is the communication system used by banks for international transfers, exclusively uses the American dollar, again because of the international payments system. And they were not letting Russia use SWIFT for a while. I know that that's still the case, but that's weaponizing the financial system. And that, again, is something which you wouldn't do if you had a proper international reserve currency. So if you had another system, then the Americans couldn't do that anymore. They'd be forcing people to use the other system.
Yeah, although, if there was another system, then we'd be looking at ways of trying to introduce sanctions against Russia, whichever way. And let's remember, because Russia did invade a country, of course. Let's remember that. So, But the idea that those BRICS nations would trade amongst themselves, though, with less trade with the West, I wonder how realistic that is. So China has a trade surplus of more than 300 billion US dollars. Now, they could say, well, okay, we don't want to see that trade surplus go down. So we are going to, how much would that affect their economy? I guess if they've got a stronger domestic economy, perhaps it becomes less important. But they could do more trade with India. But they wouldn't see that sort of trade surplus with India because India is also making stuff on the cheap. It's like if you've got a whole load of the problem with these BRICS nations is they're all in a sort of similar position, aren't they?
Well, this brings back, is international trade the engine of growth or is investment the engine of growth? I think you know which one I'm going to say. Okay, but the neoclassical focus on specialisation always says, well, getting a comparative advantage, yada, 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 is what gives you growth. It doesn't. When you look at the empirical data, and this is like Danny Roddick's work is probably the best. Roddick is an interesting character. He's neoclassical in many, many ways, but he's well and truly outside the envelope because he looks at the data, and you can't put the data inside a neoclassical envelope. So he argues that countries which have used trade surpluses to invest are the ones that have grown the fastest, and that's like the empirical data. That's true. It's investment that drives growth, not specialisation. But if you set your economy up so you get more revenue out of trade surpluses and you invest that, then you're going to grow faster. So if you have the BRICS forming a pact together, it isn't whether they get more trade out of it. To me, it's whether that leads to more investment.
Yeah. So they produce more stuff. sell more, standard of living improves for
Again,
everybody.
got over the whole, talking growth in a globe that has to contract at some point.
Yeah, exactly. But perhaps not what we want to do. But so foreign direct investment in China has actually been growing. So, in $180 billion US dollars added in 2021, the biggest investors were Singapore, South Korea, Virgin Islands. Suspect there might be a
investing in China?
Yes, yeah. I don't think it might be Virgin Islands themselves. I think it might be coming out of bank accounts in the Virgin
I think it
Islands.
might be some interesting bank accounts there. Yeah.
Japan, USA, Cayman Islands, perhaps for the same reason.
Oh, well, it's a huge country. The Cayman Islands takes you at least an hour to get around the main island. Did I tell you when my holiday with my first wife, we actually went to the Cayman Islands, and one thing I wanted to go and do was visit the building that I knew that News Corporation's a supposed global head office was in. And we got to this little whitewashed 2-story building in the heart of whatever the capital is, the Cayman Islands, and there were 30 or so brass plaques on the wall, and the place was empty.
So someone goes around and collects the post once a week, perhaps?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just to pick up the checks.
Yeah.
Wow. There we are. So, okay. So this, my point was though that from a lot of these countries, there's foreign direct investment still happening in China.
Yeah.
Helping to grow the Chinese economy, which I wonder whether that will slow down if we start to see this BRICs divide happen. Does China become too big a risk for foreign investors, and does that
I think that's independent of what happens on the financial system, but what you have in those countries is much more of the difference in those countries is a focus upon national development. That's whereas you get the West is focused on the obsession upon efficiency and optimization. It's a very, very different mindset when you say you want to grow the economy. You've got to increase the living standards of the majority of your population. So that gives you a very, very different focus upon investment out of that, rather than a focus upon portfolio optimization, which would come out of the West. So I could see that being something which did benefit those economies, not because it would mean more international trade, but because it would mean they would be more focused on achieving domestic investment. And China, of course, is doing a lot of investing in other countries as part of an influence policy through the Silk Road.
Yes,
and
Belt and Road
they're doing in Africa as well. And this, when you want to explain it, you've got to go back centuries, because the Chinese colonial system was not to have a colony. It was to conquer a country, or to let them know if they didn't kowtow, they'd be conquered, and then install a ruler who was, I've forgotten the actual term. It'll come to me halfway through the bloody radio broad, maybe on the next program. But you would have your vassal, vassal installed, and the requirement of the vassal was tithing back to the Chinese. So if you didn't send gifts back to the emperor, you might find a fleet in your port a few months later. So there was an income flow, but there wasn't political dominance. So now they're doing a sort of the capitalist version of that, investing in the rest of the economy, putting Chinese workers are doing the investing in Chinese goods are being purchased to do it. So it boosts the Chinese economy to provide what they call foreign trade, but it gives them a level of influence in each of those economies. So they behave very, very differently to the Americans.
So, and what would happen if China was to say, because China accounts for about 18.5% of global GDP, so more than the US, which is about less than 16% of GDP now. So, I mean, China is a bigger economy than the US is, supposedly. I mean, it depends how it's all measured, but I mean, they're pretty close. But if China was to say, just as America says, well, everyone's trading in the US dollar, what if China was to say, well, okay, we only want to trade in yuan? We're going to buy.
No, then that's one reason I like the BRICS proposal. They're not talking about a single currency.
Right.
They're talking about a basket of currencies.
I know, but China is so much bigger than everybody else. If they could say, well, forget about the rest of the BRICS.
Well, that could undermine them to some extent, because then they've been appreciating currency and not have the same relative currency advantage. If the Americans lose the
same thing would happen to China.
Yeah,
yes.
They'd get a appreciating currency and be less competitive in international trade. So it can actually backfire in that sense. Ultimately, the only solution is you have everybody's currency backing a single international, and that was the Bancor. So the one reason I'm particularly in favour of the BRICs going ahead is because if there are two, that is infinitely better than one, and it's heading towards a stage where there's none.
But would they, and do you think, even though they might be doing it to establish trade amongst themselves, we'd all suddenly find that actually we are using it as well? I guess we'd have to, wouldn't we? I mean, if we were buying stuff from China, then
that could be
they'd be saying, well, you've got to buy it in the BRICs currency.
And you then have a different currency. You have a different international transfer system. I mean, it's becoming anonymised for us these days anyway. I mean, I use a firm called, this is not a paid promotion, but I use a firm called Wise for my international payments. Works very well.
I also use Wise, and there are sponsorship opportunities available if anyone from Wise is listening. So no more endorsement now for free.
But that means I don't really like, am I paying in baht when I'm getting a house built in Bangkok? I'm paying in euro when I'm paying my rates.
So long as it
doesn't really matter, because as long as the transfer costs are low.
Yeah,
and
they are.
They are.
With Wise.
Yeah. But I think a huge part of the reason that people wanted a common currency for a euro, of course, was the transfer cost every time you bought.
Yeah, which is irrelevant now because we've all got cards on a consumer level, absolutely. But it's when you're starting to use a currency that is a common currency, even though you're not trading with that country. So then that becomes the nonsense. And that's where you start to get the elevated demand in the price for that currency.
And you get the power of the financial sector and the diminution of the capacity of the country to have a manufacturing sector.
Right.
That's what brought England unstuck.
Yeah.
And it's sort of brought America unstuck, but America being so much bigger than Britain and so much like the natural advantages of America in terms of having one gigantic market, but also the huge open plains. There are no major mountain ranges to negotiate. You've got the Rockies and the Appalachians, but they're nothing like having to go across the Himalayas or the division, the scale of the country enables that enormous privilege that they've had, and that countervails a lot of the stuff I'll talk about, saying advantage, disadvantage. They're starting off with a huge advantage, but China has the same advantage, that enormous open plains. So
So the big difference is probably, I'm wondering how much practical difference it makes. So if I was buying a whole lot of stuff from China now, say we were going to have debunking economics T-shirts, what a fantastic idea that would be, and mugs and signed photographs of Steve Keen, and we were going to go in big in production, and we were going to get it all produced in China. We'd be paying in Chinese currency for that anyway. We'd be transferring our pounds and
we wouldn't be strengthening the American financial sector to do it in the first instance. Yeah, which is what we are doing if we actually decide to go ahead. But
by and large, it does sort of get down to oil and commodities by and large, doesn't it?
That's a huge part of it. And like the Saudis have well and truly got the Americans tied up in knots right now, and the Saudis are the main oil exporter apart from Russia and America itself with fracking. If you break away from that, then in some ways you're weakening the whole of America over the oil industry.
So if the oil industry...
Without the oil industry, there wouldn't be capitalism.
Right. And so if the oil industry was to say, well, okay, we're a bit sick of everything trading in the US dollar, the petrodollar, let's just sell oil in the BRICs currency because they're more friendly, because they don't believe in democracy either. We would, autocratic.
Let's not give America too much of a reputation for democracy.
That's true too. But these autocratic nations standing together, they could say, well, yeah, okay, let's, we want to break the West a little bit. We still clearly they're still going to have to sell because we want to buy stuff from them, and they're going to do it cheaper than we can do it ourselves. And I think there is that point that China and India are not necessarily going to be great bedfellows in terms of trade, because they're two big populations. Wanting to,
but very, very different industrial levels, and I think you'd see a lot of that. China trying to invest in India, is partly a low wage centre. There are some things which India is much more effective at than China, and one of them, of course, involves the English language. So call centres, you don't expect a Chinese call centre, you do expect an Indian one. So there are some potential ways in which China could benefit out of
computer
that.
programmers and that sort
Computer
of thing.
programmers too. Plenty of Chinese ones of that as well, but again, many more Indians. So there are ways in which there can be synergies between those economies, which could be enhanced by having a common trading currency and not having to go through the American dollar.
Yeah. So where do we fit in all of that? How does
England?
or just the West generally? How does it change? Apart from the U.S. financial sector being damaged by it all,
anything that makes the American financial sector less powerful, I think, is a good thing for the rest of the world.
That, but what about everything else in terms of international trade? Does it actually change too much?
Not a great deal. It might change the pricing of oil, but I think what matters far more in that area is environmental issues, not pricing. I mean,
but how does it change the price of oil? So if they,
well, you'd now be buying it through, you'd be buying it through the BRIC financial system rather than through the American.
But in terms of the value or the price that you ultimately pay, is it
maybe not. I mean, it's but anything that breaks, if it makes Goldman Sachs more Goldman Sachs, then I'm in favour of it.
And the way of solving any of the discrepancy would actually be to go back to the Bancor, wouldn't it?
Yeah. That's what I see this thing as a step towards. I mean, there's so many things I want to see achieved in policy which are never going to happen, but one of them being a Bancor, and a step in that direction is to have more than one international currency system.
So I wonder if you got President Xi and Vladimir Putin together and said, well, okay, this is the way we think the world should go. There has been too much dominance in the US dollar. We'd like to. We can understand why you're trying to go. You'd want to break off in another direction. But why don't we do this on a global scale and have a currency that nobody owns? I wonder whether Mr. Putin would say, well, that's a big step forward. Maybe I'll settle with my boundaries as they were before.
And what you then have is, well, I mean, because you always cause peace in the Ukraine, I'm not going to hold my breath on that front. But you could easily have countries saying, well, I want to sign up with a bank with this BRIC system so long as my currency is part of the basket.
It's a thought, isn't it? I wonder whether it'll happen.
Well, I think we're going to overwhelmed by events is more likely my expectation there, but this would be one change at the global level that I'd actually be happy to see.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep the pressure. I mean, there's only a few thousand people listening to us, but that 3,000 could be 10 million in 10 years. I don't know. It's going to take time, isn't it? All right. Okay. Very good. We'll leave it there for now. Good to talk, Steve. Hopefully that's answered some of Pola's questions.
I hope so.
Some of the other part of his email, by the way, was: isn't it amazing that we still pay more for a litre of milk or soft drink than petrol? This is changing, perhaps more likely. Could cause a slowdown of waste by making people think more about what is essential. Energy is the shock we need to have to change what we are doing.
The thing is, without energy being the shock, we wouldn't have capitalism to begin with, and this is the key issue. Cheap oil, cheap energy is the foundation of our society. It always has been.
Yeah.
And the search for cheaper and cheaper energy sources is what's driven human industrialization over time. Well, so it has to be cheaper. If you pay full cost, then you wouldn't have. You couldn't make a profit, but that's the trouble. We've now got ourselves in a climatic situation where we can't continue doing this.
So we should be paying the full cost. So look, I mean, that's I'll add that to the list. That's the second part of his email. I'll add that to the list. We've got quite a few to get through, so it's going to be a few weeks before we get back to that, Pola. But we'll look more about, and Steve will love that because he loves talking about energy prices. So
I hate it, but I've got to talk about it.
We'll talk about that in coming weeks. That's it for now, though. Good to talk, Steve.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.